Hey guys, tonight we set our sights on the curiously somber world of Victorian mourning fashion. And trust me, you probably won't survive this all-black extravaganza without at least one raised eyebrow. The Victorians practically wrote the handbook on how to grieve in style, draping themselves in layer upon layer of midnight, colored garments, and elaborately veiled hats. But before you slip under your blanket and let the darkness of the era lull you to sleep, we have a little housekeeping to do. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. So drop your location and local hour in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You rest your head on your pillow and imagine the clack of carriage wheels on cobblestone streets. Gaslit lanterns flicker along avenues lined with houses veiled in black creep. It's nighttime, a fitting hour to slip into the hush of this bygone era. The first thing you notice is an almost overwhelming sense of gravity. There's a deliberate stillness about these people, as though the entire world has paused for a moment of collective sorrow. Suddenly, you find yourself wearing a voluminous black cloak. It's heavy on your shoulders, the fabric thick and plain. You reach up to touch a veil that drapes over your face, obscuring your vision like a light fog. This is your introduction to Victorian mourning culture, an elaborate set of customs designed to put grief on public display. If you were a widow back in the mid-1800s, you'd be expected to follow strict etiquette rules, dictating everything from the color and material of your clothes to how often and if you could appear in society. The moment you stepped out of your home, you were a walking announcement. Yes, I'm in mourning. This is my sadness, made visible for everyone to see. It's a little dramatic, sure, but when your queen, Victoria herself, set the trend by wearing black for decades after her husband Prince Albert's death, you can bet the rest of the nation would follow suit. Already, your mind might be brimming with questions. For instance, did they really replace all the curtains in the house with black cloth? You glance around and spot a curtained window, edges fraying where it's been pinned up. Indeed, some families took this to an extreme. Black bombazine on every windowsill, black ribbons on the doorknobs, black gloves on the servants. It might sound like a macabre way to decorate airs, and probably a nightmare to keep clean, but it was a genuine societal expectation at the time. The seriousness of death was reflected in every possible corner of daily life. Even children got looped in, dressed in black or subdued shades, although sometimes you'd see a kid wearing a slightly less somber color if the family was transitioning out of the heaviest period of mourning. A mainstream historical fact you might find interesting: Queen Victoria remained in mourning from Prince Albert's death in 1861 until her own passing in 1901, 40 years of black dresses and solemn public appearances, though she was not continuously in the heaviest stage of mourning for all that time. Still, her reputation as the Widow of Windsor left an indelible mark on the era. People took their cues from the monarch, and if the Queen was going to cloak herself in black for what felt like an eternity, then the rest of society would adopt at least a version of her perpetual grief, where wearing mourning clothing wasn't merely a personal statement of loss. It was a way to communicate with your neighbors, friends, and even strangers that you were coping with sorrow. Strangely enough, this rather grim practice bred an entire marketplace of mourning dressmakers and suppliers. You might even joke that if you owned a haberdashery specializing in black crepe and black ribbon, you'd have been on a sure path to becoming a Victorian millionaire, assuming you didn't get overshadowed by bigger, more established family-run businesses. That's your first joke of the night. Mourning as a booming industry. Who would have thought sadness could be so profitable? But there's a quirky fact about these practices that might raise your eyebrows. Some families chose to wear black, not just for immediate relatives, but for more distant connections, like second or third cousins. This sometimes led to extended periods of wearing mourning attire, resulting in folks looking perpetually dressed for a funeral. In the eyes of the modern observer, that might sound like an excessive, even performative display of grief. Historians still argue whether these protracted periods of black garb were genuinely representative of deep personal loss, or were simply a duty-bound ritual to honor social norms and familial reputations. After all, no one wanted to be the scandalous relative who dared to wear a daringly colorful frock while a distant aunt was supposedly being mourned. In your mind's eye, you see a small group in the corner of a drawing room. They're speaking in hushed tones. There's a certain gravity in their manner, as though they're hyper, aware of every rustle of black silk. You catch faint traces of conversation about how the parlor would need to be redecorated for the next phase of mourning, which, if you're following the correct schedule, might be second mourning. Let's slip in a light-hearted moment for you. Imagine if you were invited to one of these gatherings and showed up in hot pink. The gasp would be so loud, it'd probably rattle the teacups off the table. There's your second joke, though for the Victorians, it was no laughing matter. As you drift deeper into this midnight realm, you detect a faint floral smell from wreaths. Often, flowers were incorporated into mourning decor, presumably to mask the less pleasant aromas that might come from long wakes or overshadow the musty smell of all that black fabric. Lilies, white roses, and lavender were common because they symbolized purity, remembrance, and some kind of gentle comfort. It's a welcome breath of fresh air in a sea of gloom. And all this fuss, it serves an underlying need we sometimes overlook: closure. For many Victorians, these rituals gave them a tangible way to process heartbreak. Dressing the part was like wearing a big sign that said, "I'm grieving. Please be respectful." In a time when daily life could be precarious, illnesses lurking around every corner, medical science not quite up to modern standards, it helped to have set rules that organized everyone's emotions. That doesn't mean people didn't sometimes resent the strictness or the never-ending black, but it did give them a sense of structure during chaos. Now, as your eyelids get heavier, you might imagine yourself moving closer to a window, peering out into the night. A single carriage passes by, its driver also dressed in dark attire. The horses' reins have black tassels, a subtle detail that underscores just how pervasive these customs were. Even the animals weren't safe from the sartorial demands of the time. A horse in full black regalia, you say. That's your third joke, though for the Victorians, it was deadly serious. They wouldn't have their funeral coachman showing up in cheerful attire any more than they'd allow the horse to wear a polka dot harness. With that image, you begin to settle into the faint hush of this silent parade of solemn fashion. A part of you wonders whether, in some twisted way, these strict customs offered a source of comfort. A sense that in the face of death, there was an established way to behave. Another part of you aches at the thought of wearing scratchy black crepe year after year, your social freedoms bound by rigid codes of conduct. Yet here you are, sinking into the mysterious ambience, letting the quiet drama pull you ever deeper into a strange corner of history. You linger in that twilight realm of black carriages and draped windows, feeling the weight of custom and curiosity settle around you. Then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, you drift toward the central figure of this entire movement, Queen Victoria herself. Picture a petite woman in a voluminous black gown, eyes swollen from crying but set with steely determination. Prince Albert's death in 1861 struck her like a hammer blow. She was inconsolable, withdrawing from public life and plunging headfirst into a state of mourning that was extreme even by her era's standards. You catch a glimpse of her pacing through the halls of Windsor Castle, black lace trailing behind her on polished floors. Despite her regal demeanor, she radiates an intense sorrow that would, almost unbelievably, reshape how an entire nation, and beyond, dressed to grieve. In your mind, you follow her as she retreats from official duties. She's draped in a black bombazine gown and a widow's cap, an ever-present reminder of her heartbreak. You can't help but think that if anyone else decided to spend decades in what was basically funereal attire, the gossip would be never-ending. But this was the Queen, and Victorian Britain was quick to adapt. Soon, shops overflowed with mourning goods. Women throughout the kingdom took their cues from her, feeling oddly validated in their own grief. At least one mainstream historical fact emerges from all this black fabric. Queen Victoria didn't just popularize a short-term trend. She effectively extended a dress code that had always been present, but now moved into near-permanent status. If the widow of Windsor never came out of mourning, how could her subjects? You noticed that this wave of inky fashion wasn't only about clothing. It was a deeper cultural shift. Citizens, eager to show solidarity or avoid social missteps, emulated the Queen. To many, it felt almost patriotic to reflect her grief in their own wardrobes. Imagine strolling down a London street at midday. The scene would look more like midnight. A swirl of black taffeta, black bonnets, black gloves, and even black parasols, like a funeral that never ends. If you were trying to stand out, you'd be better off becoming a stage magician, because wearing anything but black was sure to dazzle and shock. There's your first joke. An aspiring illusionist amid a sea of black crepe might at least bring some color in the form of a few doves. The Victoria's mourning rituals weren't just for show. She was genuinely heartbroken. She frequently visited the mausoleum at Frogmore, where Albert was laid to rest, sometimes leaving fresh flowers or mementos. But here's a quirky tidbit. Rumor had it that she insisted on laying out Albert's clothes every single day, as though expecting him to walk back in and put them on. True or not, these stories fed the mythos of Victoria's endless grief, making her mourning attire seem like more than just a symbol of fashion. It was a symbol of undying devotion. The public couldn't help but talk about it, and in some corners, there was a sense of admiration for her fidelity, though a few daring souls whispered that this prolonged mourning cast a pall over the entire country's morale and might have gone too far. Historians still argue whether Victoria's perpetual mourning was purely personal sorrow, or whether she utilized it as a tool for political power, consciously crafting an image of the grieving widow to command sympathy and loyalty. Perhaps it was a mix of both heartbreak and a monarch's careful management of her public persona. You catch a glimpse of her signing documents at a small desk, the black lace of her sleeve brushing the parchment. There's an undeniable gravitas in the scene, yet you can't escape the sense that her sorrow had become a part of her identity, one that she was not willing or able to relinquish. Meanwhile, the fashion industry boomed. Mourning clothing wasn't a single outfit you bought once. There were multiple stages, each requiring new garments. Crepe for deep mourning, slightly lighter fabrics for second mourning, subdued greys and lavenders for half mourning. If you had the money, you'd cycle through these stages with a new wardrobe each time, sometimes spending an absurd amount on black ribbons and accessories. In a way, Queen Victoria's tears were fueling an entire economy. Dressmakers couldn't believe their luck. Imagine them exclaiming, "Long live the Queen in black." There's your second joke, though in fairness, these tailors and milliners were likely torn between compassion for their grieving monarch and the reality that her sorrow paid their bills. Walking through a Victorian department store in your mind, you see shelves stacked high with crepe, bombazine, and black jet jewelry. The clinking of polished jet beads is mesmerizing. A young saleswoman, dressed head to toe in a respectful dark ensemble, offers you a selection of mourning brooches. This style was favored by Her Majesty, she might say, hoping to entice you. Outside the shop's window display, more black parasols dot the pavement, bobbing up and down like crows fluttering about after a rain. It's a strange sight, and you might feel a bit uneasy at how grief has become such a spectacle, how it's on sale for anyone to purchase. Yet for many Victorians, imitating Victoria was less about commerce and more about etiquette. It was simply what one did. If the Queen mourned for so long, the rest of us had better at least put on black for a decent spell, lest we look disrespectful. There's a practical side to this, of course. Wearing black was an obvious visual cue that you were in a sensitive emotional state. Maybe that helped keep small talk at bay, or allowed some breathing room during a time when emotional expression wasn't exactly mainstream. "I'm sorry for your loss" might be a more frequently heard phrase if you showed up in black bombazine rather than a bright green silk gown. Amid this ocean of sorrow, you might wonder how people coped. Some found comfort in these rituals, aligning their daily life with a measured process of grief. Others simply had no choice. If the Queen set the bar, you followed suit. Peer pressure was powerful, especially in higher social circles. Dare to show up at a royal event in a colour that whispered, "Moving on," and you'd be the subject of scathing gossip columns the next morning. It's as if the entire upper crust of society was locked in a sort of chain reaction, each person's wardrobe decisions reinforcing the next. Before anyone knew it, the colour black was everywhere, like a cosmic joke on the range of colours that might have brightened 19th century Britain. There's your third joke. Imagine a rainbow in the sky quickly turning black out of peer pressure. In a sense, Queen Victoria's tears not only shaped the fashion of her time, but also restructured the cultural landscape around death. The era's philosophy hinged on the idea that grief should be worn, seen, and acknowledged. This approach might strike you as both remarkably poignant and a tad overbearing. After all, that heavy black gown looks fairly suffocating. You can almost feel your shoulders tense beneath its weight, the fabric itchy against your arms. But there's also something strangely comforting about a universal way of showing loss, as if the entire society had agreed to offer you a small bubble of understanding whenever they saw you in mourning attire. So you stand there, imagining yourself outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, watching Queen Victoria as she steps into her carriage for a rare public appearance. Even as years roll on, she remains draped in the black that has become her personal hallmark. You find yourself contemplating how a single person's grief, amplified by her status, could ripple outward, blackening wardrobes from the highest aristocrats to the simplest shopkeepers. Yet beneath that sheen of conformity, each person's grief remains uniquely their own, shaped by personal memories and familial love. And that's perhaps what Victoria's tears truly gave the world: a shared space in which a very private, human emotion could be expressed in public, whether or not you agreed with all the strictness that came along with it. You follow the trail of black veils and heavy fabrics, stepping into the hushed interior of a Victorian sitting room where mourning attire takes center stage. A half-finished gown drapes over a dressmaker's mannequin, its voluminous folds of black crades spilling onto the floor like an inkwell knocked over. The seamstress pins between her lips, measures each pleat and tuck with exacting precision. You can almost hear her murmuring. These sleeves need to be full enough to convey the depth of sorrow, but not so extravagant as to be mistaken for evening wear. Yes, every stitch is loaded with significance here. You wander around the edges of the room, drawn to the bolts of cloth stacked neatly against the wall. There's black bombazine, a stiff, dull material often preferred for the earliest and heaviest stage of mourning. You let the rough texture rub against your fingertips, its coarse, like a permanent reminder of heartbreak. Right beside it is black crapie, so matte it almost swallows the light. Crapie had a reputation for being scratchy and notoriously difficult to clean, which is unfortunate since tears, the occasional cup of tea, or even a gust of city dust might land on the fabric. You stifle a grin at the thought. Imagine trying to console a grieving friend whose black crapie gown is shedding fibers everywhere. So much for a sympathetic shoulder. There's your first joke. Victims of runny mascara and crapie might look like a living Rorschach test. Then there's the transition to dull greys and purples, a phase that comes later when you've moved past the rawness of your loss. This is sometimes called second mourning, half mourning, depending on how precise you want to be. You pick up a length of grey silk, the colour of a storm cloud, and imagine it draped as a gown. To modern eyes, it still looks sombre, but compared to pitch black bombazine, it feels downright festive. Another bolt in a pale lavender shade sits close by. You run your hand across it, thinking it might look rather nice under different circumstances. But here, it's just another step in the prescribed journey of grieving. Once black is deemed too severe, you inch toward these muted tones, letting society know that your sorrow, though still present, is somewhat less acute. The Victorians had an almost obsessive devotion to these colour rules. If you jumped from full mourning black to, say, a cheerful shade of sky blue, your neighbours would talk, maybe even recoil in disbelief. It was a delicate dance. A mainstream historical fact that might interest you is that this colour-coded approach to mourning had earlier roots in Europe, but the Victorians systematized it to a degree few had seen before. Take the 16th century. Black was certainly common for mourning, but it wasn't until the Victorian era that wearing black, and doing so in distinct stages, became a near universal social code. And if you were wealthy, you might change your wardrobe multiple times within a single mourning period, each garment meticulously reflecting how many months had passed since your loss. Historians still argue whether this intensely structured approach to grief truly helped individuals process their emotions, or simply added more pressure at a vulnerable time. Some believe that these rigorous color shifts gave mourners a visual and symbolic path for healing. You start in the darkest place and gradually move toward lighter shades, mirroring your emotional journey. Others suggest it was just another set of societal expectations that forced people to perform grief. An outward show that might not match their internal feelings. You can see both sides of it as you watch the seamstress cut into a fresh piece of black cloth. Perhaps for some, the ritual was comforting, while for others, it felt like an elaborate cage. Still, as you stand in that sitting room, the reality is that color rules governed Victorian life in ways that are hard to fathom today. Even the dyed black ribbons for tying back hair or trimming hats had to be a particular shade, a deep, lusterless black that signaled solemnity. You pick up a spool of ribbon and run it between your fingers, noticing that it's not quite pitch black but more of a charcoal hue. You wonder if that might elicit a disapproving glance from a particularly strict dowager who insists on total darkness for at least the first year. Indeed, some families extended these rules to their servants, insisting that they don black armbands or subdued uniforms. And if you really wanted to go above and beyond, you'd drape the entire household, lampshades, doorknobs, curtains, and more, in black. Victorian houses in mourning could be awfully dim places. A quirky tidbit pops into your head: some mourners found creative ways to reuse or alter their mourning clothes once they'd moved on to the next phase. Since fabrics were pricey, it wasn't uncommon to see people dye or restyle their garments. In fact, there's a story of a resourceful woman who, after shifting to half mourning, removed the black trim from her gown and replaced it with lavender embellishments, only to reattach the black trim weeks later when a distant relative passed, forcing her back into full mourning. You chuckle softly, picturing this endless cycle of pinning on and ripping off black lace. That's your second joke. Like the ultimate clothing puzzle where sadness is the only reason you keep re-puzzling. You step closer to the dressmaker's mannequin for a final look at the black gown in progress. It's surprisingly heavy, the weight of the many layers. A corset beneath, petticoats, then the outer garment, almost makes you feel short of breath. You imagine wearing it on a hot summer day. Victorian houses weren't exactly equipped with modern air conditioning, and city streets bustled with horses and carriages stirring up the dust. How did people manage? Well, they endured. It was, after all, the done thing. Complaining might be frowned upon, as it could suggest that your comfort was more important than paying respect to the deceased. There was also something ritualistic about choosing fabrics that lacked any shine or bounce. Glossy textures might appear too festive, too jovial, and forget about patterns, unless they were discreet or on tone. If you were deep in mourning, you didn't want to be caught wearing something that shimmered in candlelight. You think back to a snippet of conversation. Mother wouldn't dream of wearing satin until she's at least in second mourning. The idea of someone policing your wardrobe to that extent sounds almost comical now, but in Victorian society, it was as natural as breathing, like wearing a team jersey today to support your favorite sports club. Meanwhile, the fabric choices extended beyond dresses. Men's suits in black wool or twill were expected, often with black gloves and a mourning band around the hat. Even children might be outfitted in black or subdued shades, which seems particularly heartbreaking. The bright outfits of childhood swapped for these funerary tones. Yet, it wasn't all gloom as children grew bored or fidgety. You can picture a mother taking a ragged black ribbon from her child's hair just to keep the peace. There's your third joke. Imagine little ones squirming around like, "Mum, can I at least have polka dots on my ribbons?" The entire system of color rules was so comprehensive that you might say the Victorians had a veritable rainbow of mourning shades, ranging from black as night to grey as a rain cloud to mauve and lavender that whispered, "I'm still sad, but I might be okay someday." And in a way, these color-coded stages formed a silent language. If you spotted a friend in half mourning, you'd know enough time had passed that it might be acceptable to invite them for a quiet afternoon tea. If they were dressed in unrelieved black, you'd approach them gently, not expecting them to join social outings. It's a nuanced dance, and for those who adhered to it, color was more than just a fashion statement. It was a declaration of emotion coded into cloth. All this comes to mind as you watch the seamstress carefully pack away her pins, folding the black gown into a neat bundle that's ready for fitting. Tomorrow, someone will wear this garment and present themselves to the world as a living symbol of loss. It might be a recent widow, or perhaps a daughter mourning a parent. But whichever stage of grief they're in, they'll be wrapped in the era's unwavering expectation that sorrow must be seen in thread and dye. As you step back, the hushed room seems to exhale, the black fabrics rustling like a shared lament. You let yourself sink deeper into that quiet, comforting darkness, pondering whether having such rigid guidelines might help the mind find some semblance of order in chaos, or if it simply boxes the heart in. As the seamstress's shears finally hush, you slip through a narrow doorway into another quiet parlour, a slightly more intimate space where the protocols for grieving wives unfold in painstaking detail. You notice a newly widowed woman perched on a settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She's dressed head to toe in what the Victorians termed widow's weeds, a somber uniform that leaves no doubt about her loss. A heavy black veil spills from the brim of her bonnet, brushing against her waist. She seems almost cocooned, separated from the world by this gauzy curtain of sorrow. You stand a few steps away, observing the subtle differences in her attire compared to others in mourning. It's not just the black dress, although that's certainly a major feature. It's the layered crape covering every surface, from collar to skirt hem. It's the length of the veil that extends well below her elbows, symbolizing the depth of her grief. And it's the near, complete absence of decoration. Even the smallest hint of lace or embroidery else, beyond the standard black crape, would be deemed too frivolous for a proper widow in the first stage of mourning. You can almost feel the weight of it. The garment seemed to envelop her, as though even standing up would require an effort of will. A mainstream historical fact underscores this: Victorian etiquette guides often advised that a widow remain in full mourning for at least a year and a day, during which time she was expected to wear only black. She might move into second mourning after that, typically transitioning to slightly lighter fabrics and allowing limited trimmings in white or grey. However, the truly devout, and often deeply traditional, widows might extend their weeds indefinitely, mourning their spouses publicly for the rest of their lives. In extreme cases, it became a badge of piety, an outward demonstration of a sorrow that never ended. Historians still argue whether these strict protocols provided widows with a structured framework to grieve, or trapped them in a never-ending performance of sadness. On one hand, wearing weeds functioned as a shield, granting a kind of temporary sanctuary from social pressures. Neighbors saw the veil and automatically knew to speak in hushed tones, offer condolences, and not invite the widow to raucous gatherings. On the other hand, that same veil could become a prison, cutting the widow off from normal activities, from conversations that might bring solace, or from small joys that could rekindle a spark of life. You sense the tension in the air as the woman on the settee, despite her polite posture, seems guarded. She's probably considering her new social limitations. A widow in deep mourning wasn't expected, or in many cases even allowed, to attend social events. Balls, dinner parties, theatres, absolutely off limits. She might receive close friends in her home, but even then, it was usually a subdued affair, no laughter above a muted chuckle. That's your first joke. Imagine trying to muzzle your giggle at a tea party because you're wearing the official costume of sadness. Good luck with that. Still, there's a quirky tidbit in all this solemnity. Some widows found creative loopholes. For instance, if they absolutely had to attend a public function, they might hide at the back or slip in and out quickly. Others capitalized on any appropriate charitable events, because helping orphans or funding a new hospital wing was considered suitably somber, and used those gatherings as their rare social outlet. You can almost see them in your mind, carefully adjusting their veils so as to appear devoutly mournful while secretly feeling relieved to be out of the house. A small spark of life might flicker under the black crape like a clandestine breath of fresh air. Part of you wonders how younger widows coped. Imagine being a 22-year-old bride who, within a year, loses her husband to an illness or an accident. You might be locked into wearing widow's weeds at a time when your peers are stepping out into society, forging alliances, attending dances. Instead, there you are, swathed in crepe and largely confined to your home, at least for the first part of your grief. And if you bristle at these protocols and try to break them, well, expect raised eyebrows and whispered gossip in the candlelit corridors of your social circle. Did you see her wearing, gasp, an ivory ribbon on her wrist? She only lost her husband 6 months ago. So there's your second joke. Although for the Victorian upper class, such a scandal might as well have been an earthquake. You can almost hear the tapping of teacups in the next room, accompanied by polite murmurs about an unfortunate widow who dared to trim her bonnet with a discreet rosette after a mere 11 months. These are the unspoken rules that govern a widow's behavior: no loud conversation, no flamboyant garments, certainly no public amusements. She's expected to be the living epitome of woe, a billboard for her heartbreak. In a world without social media, the color of your dress was your status update, broadcasting to everyone your emotional journey. As you continue to observe, you notice the limited gestures of comfort offered to this widow. Friends might stop by to bring a meal or share a quiet chat, but there's also a sense that people tiptoe around her, as though her grief is contagious. Ironically, this can result in further isolation, a lonely predicament where the thing to do is stay away unless explicitly invited. Another layer of black crepe on the widow's heart, if you will. Amid all these constraints, you can't help but sympathize with the exhaustion that must come from constantly projecting sorrow. Where does genuine healing fit into this picture? Perhaps, for some, adhering to every last rule felt like an anchor in a storm. If you follow each custom to the letter, at least you know you're doing it correctly. But for others, it had to be draining, like an endless theater performance in which you're never allowed to drop character. There's your third joke. Maybe you'd slip a note under the door of your best friend's house. Send chocolate and comedic novels. I'm suffocating under this veil. When you peek at the widow on the settee again, you notice the black veil is slightly translucent. Sometimes, These veils were so thick that seeing through them was a challenge, which presumably also helped shield the wearer's tears or expressions from prying eyes. Yet there were gradations even in veil transparency. Thicker in full mourning, then thinner in second mourning, and eventually you might discard the veil altogether, though you'd still wear black. It's a visual code that shifts over time, letting others track your progress through the labyrinth of sorrow. A final detail strikes you: the widow's calling cards. Victorian etiquette dictated that she might have her cards edged in black, sometimes a thin border, sometimes a wide one, depending on the stage of mourning. If she was not ready to receive visitors, she could simply send her card and remain safely out of sight. And if she progressed into a more socially active phase, the black edge might narrow. It was like a silent conversation, carried out through stationery. "I'm not ready yet," or "I'm easing back into the world." You can't help but think, in an era where everything else was so formal, of course even paper had its own dress code. With that, you take a final glance at the widow, her posture impossibly straight despite the weight of her garments. You can see that her eyes, though downcast, hold a flicker of resilience. Perhaps she'll find solace in these strict routines, or maybe she'll resent every inch of black crappie before the year is out. Either way, she's bound to these conventions by the invisible threads of Victorian society, as tightly as if she were sewn into the fabric itself. The hush in the room intensifies, and you feel the heaviness of her sorrow like a palpable presence. It's a relief when you step back into the corridor, letting the door close gently behind you. Yet a part of you remains with her, wondering if the darkness of widow's weeds ever truly lifts, or simply fades to grey. Stepping away from the hush of the widow's parlour, you venture into another dimension of Victorian mourning, the men's realm. Compared to the elaborate layers of fabric that enshroud a grieving woman, the mourning attire of Victorian gentlemen might seem almost understated. Still, don't be fooled. It carried its own strict rules, and stepping outside them could raise as many eyebrows as a widow daring to swap her crêpe veil for a lacy one too soon. Imagine a gentleman of the era, perhaps freshly bereaved of a parent. He stands in front of his wardrobe, pondering which black frock coat to wear. The choices may look narrow, just black on black, but there are subtleties: the type of fabric, the shine of the lapel, the weight of the cloth. Maybe it's a crisp black wool coat over a black waistcoat, paired with subdued black trousers. Even the cravat or tie is black, possibly matte to avoid any suggestion of levity. A black top hat completes the look, though it might bear a mourning band, often a piece of crêpe draped around it, to make the statement of grief loud and clear. You can almost hear him mutter to himself, "Is this enough to show my respect? Or will Aunt Agatha say I'm underdressed?" So there's your first joke. Poor chap can't catch a break from the fashion police, even in sorrow. One mainstream historical fact is that men generally observed shorter official mourning periods than women. While a widow might remain in the depths of black crape for over a year, a widower often had fewer expectations about how long his clothes should reflect his loss. This wasn't necessarily because men felt grief less acutely, but rather it reflected social norms that assigned men a more public role, running businesses, attending civic duties, or managing estates. Restricting them to months of inactivity or strictly coded attire was seen as impractical. That said, there was still a tacit understanding that for a set duration, maybe several weeks or months, he'd adopt a subdued wardrobe: black gloves, black hat band, black cravats. And if you were really going all in, you might add a black armband to your coat sleeve, a small but unmistakable badge of bereavement. You drift along a dimly lit corridor lined with portraits, noticing that many of the painted gentlemen wear dark suits, some of which may be mourning attire captured for posterity. A specific painting draws your attention. A somber figure stands beside a table, one hand resting on a tall black hat with a wide mourning band. The expression on his face seems distant, as though he's seen better days. The painter has highlighted the gleam of the black fabric, just enough to show its quality. This was often how men communicated the seriousness of their grief, while maintaining a certain dignity: no flamboyant frills or lace, but well-tailored garments in impeccable condition. You think to yourself that if men's mourning attire were described on a modern runway, it might be called something like funereal chic. So there's your second joke. Imagine a fashion show commentary. Here we see Lord Farnsworth, sporting the latest in sorrowful evening wear. Still, there's a quirky tidbit about men's mourning practices that might surprise you. While the Victorian era insisted on black suits for outward appearances, many men also used subtle signals to show just how deep their mourning ran. For instance, the handkerchief they carried might have a black border, or their stationery would bear a thick black edge. In some cases, a man might even wear black cufflinks made of jet or onyx. Tiny details that only the observant would catch. These accessories served as a quiet reflection of personal sorrow. Not everyone paraded around in full mourning regalia for extended periods, especially if they had pressing business interests that required them to stay socially active. But those small adornments allowed them to remain visually in solidarity with grief, without hindering their everyday responsibilities too much. If you follow him into a London club, imagine the hush of leather armchairs and wood, panelled walls. You might see a handful of men in black suits. Some have black bands on their left arms or hats stacked in the corner adorned with black ribbons. They converse in low tones, occasionally glancing down at their attire, as though to remind each other that there's a shared sorrow in the room. Yet the moment could shift to talk of politics or the day's news, leaving you to wonder how much of their grief they truly wear on their sleeves, and how much is simply expected courtesy. Historians still argue whether men's comparatively lighter mourning obligations reflected genuine social priorities, or a kind of unspoken sexism. Perhaps the idea was that men's roles as providers and public figures couldn't be impeded by prolonged, elaborate mourning. Alternatively, some suggest men got off easier because Victorian culture granted them more freedom to move beyond performative grief. A man could remove his black band sooner, slip back into the normal routines of life, and nobody would accuse him of forgetting the deceased. On the flip side, a widow who dared lighten her dresses too soon was practically branded a social pariah. It's one of those debates that reveals how gendered the entire mourning process was, highlighting the invisible scaffolding that kept society upright, or constrained, depending on your viewpoint. As you continue to explore, you notice that men's mourning garb wasn't always purely black from head to toe. For certain relatives, more distant ones, he might opt for standard dark suits with a black tie or cravat, allowing him to avoid the full solemnity demanded for immediate family members. The difference was subtle but important. You didn't want to appear indifferent to a cousin's passing, but you also didn't want to look like you'd lost your spouse if that wasn't the case. The male uniform of the era made such gradations less obvious than a woman shifting from all black to lighter tones, but the intention was similar. There was a kind of coded communication about the depth of your loss. Occasionally, a gentleman might face the paradox of overlapping mourning periods, losing multiple relatives in quick succession. You picture a man flipping through a mental calendar of how many weeks he'd been in mourning for his aunt, just as news arrives that his brother passed away. Does he restart his entire wardrobe at the deepest black, or does he tack on an extra black armband? For those with sprawling family trees, it might feel like permanent gloom. There's your third joke. Someone might need a color-coded timetable just to keep track. Is it the second mourning for Aunt Mildred, or the third mourning for Cousin Harold? I can't keep it straight. Social gatherings presented their own dilemmas. If you were a gentleman in mourning, you might still appear at a public event, but you'd keep your interactions minimal. Perhaps you'd exchange polite nods, avoid dancing ace if dancing was unoffered, and make an early exit. Everyone would understand that you were merely fulfilling an obligation by showing up for a colleague or a friend. Meanwhile, the presence of your black attire would function like a beacon, reminding others that you weren't fully available for light-hearted banter. It could be an uncomfortable balancing act, but social expectations often demanded at least a cursory appearance. One more facet of men's mourning deserves a spotlight: the relationship between mourning attire and military uniforms. If a man was in the armed forces, how did he navigate these codes of dress? Generally, a black crepe armband over the uniform served as a universal signal of bereavement. The uniform itself might remain the same color, often red or blue in certain regiments, but the black band was an unmistakable marker. Even so, some officers chose to wear black gloves or add a black sash for formal events. This intersection of duty and sorrow showcased how flexible yet pervasive mourning customs were. Even in the ranks, tradition had to be honored. After spending time in the quiet gloom of men's mourning, you emerge into the evening air. Perhaps you spot a few gentlemen hurrying along the cobbled streets, their black coats blending into the dusk. A fleeting thought crosses your mind. Compared to the widows weighed down by layers of suffocating black crepe, these men seem relatively unencumbered. Yes, they wear black suits, but suits are already standard for so many Victorian occasions. The difference lies in the accessories and the mandatory gloom that lingers around them. It's a subtlety not lost on you. Yet, You can't help but admire the formal elegance in their attire. If you were to stand them side by side, men in mourning next to men dressed for an ordinary day, you'd see only slight differences: darker ties, perhaps an armband. The point was to communicate respect, not to overwhelm. In fact, there's a certain dignity in the restraint. For better or worse, Victorian society expected men to remain steady in the face of tragedy. So they wore their black, bowed their heads, and carried on. Whether that was a healthier approach to grief or just another societal performance remains open to question. But for now, as you watch the last of the black-clad figures disappear down a lamplit street, you sense that you've glimpsed the quieter side of Victorian sorrow, one that speaks volumes in the hush of a well-fitted coat. A faint glow catches your eye, a subtle glint that draws you down a narrow corridor into a modest drawing room. On a small table, you see a collection of trinkets arranged like tiny relics from a shrine. Each piece, upon closer inspection, resonates with a certain poignancy. These are mourning accessories, the macabre jewelry trends that defined Victorian bereavement. An onyx brooch, jet beaded necklaces, and carefully braided locks of hair peek out from velvet cases. It's an odd assortment, but in the Victorian mindset, these items served as tangible mementos of lost loved ones. You pick up a brooch that seems heavier than its size would suggest. Its frame is made from polished jet, gleaming but dark, like obsidian. In the center, there's a compartment holding a snippet of hair, arranged in an intricate pattern. Hair jewelry was all the rage back then, especially for mourning. You can almost picture a Victorian artisan painstakingly weaving a deceased relative's hair into a brooch or a ring, every twist a tribute to memory. It strikes you as both intimate and unsettling, carrying a piece of the departed not just in your heart, but pinned right to your clothing. You can almost imagine your modern-day friend's reaction if you said, "I'm wearing great grandma's hair for luck." So there's your first joke. Let's just say that's not going to start a new hashtag trend. One mainstream historical fact stands out. Queen Victoria herself popularized jet jewelry by wearing it throughout her prolonged mourning for Prince Albert. Hailing primarily from Whitby in North Yorkshire, jet became the go-to material for mourning pieces. The demand soared, fueling an entire industry dedicated to crafting brooches, lockets, earrings, and even decorative comms. For a time, Whitby jet workshops thrived, turning out countless tokens of sorrow that ended up pinned to the collars and cuffs of the grief-stricken. The weight of black jewelry dangling from so many ears and necks must have been a near-constant reminder that death was never far away in Victorian life. You reach for a ring next. Set into the band is a minuscule portrait, framed by a band of intricately carved black. On the backside, there's a small glass pane beneath which lies a thread of hair. It's hardly visible, but the knowledge that it's there feels eerie. For some Victorians, this closeness to the deceased brought comfort, like keeping a beloved's essence within arm's reach at all times. Others found it a bit morbid, but that didn't curb the fashion. Indeed, it was more than a mere fad. It was practically a rite of passage when someone passed away. The family would snip a lock of hair and commission a jeweler to transform it into a wearable remembrance. Historians still argue whether the popularity of hair-based mourning jewelry was driven primarily by genuine sentiment or by a sort of cultural obsession with death and sentimentality. Perhaps it was a mix, real love interwoven with a fascination for the physical relics of a lost one. After all, in an age when photography was still an emerging technology, daguerreotypes and later photographs were not yet ubiquitous. Hair provided a tangible, personal connection. If I can't keep them with me in life, I can at least keep a piece of them in this brooch, might have been the thinking. And so, families collected and cherished these delicate creations, handing them down as heirlooms, each new generation inheriting a cluster of other people's hair. There's your second joke. Imagine rummaging through Grandma's jewelry box and finding an entire album of braided hair pieces, a genealogical hair chart. You stroll around the room, noticing more than just jewelry. There are decorative wreaths and framed designs made from, yes, you guessed it, human hair. Some are surprisingly elaborate, arranged in flowers and curls, occasionally incorporating small seed pearls or beads for contrast. A quirky tidbit you learn is that some home-based craftspeople specialized in turning hair into ornate wreaths that families would hang on the wall, an odd combination of decor and commemoration. The wreath might symbolize eternal life, an artistic statement that said, they may be gone, but their presence adorns our home forever. Modern eyes might find it downright ghoulish, but to the Victorians, it was a meaningful tribute. Jet, of course, wasn't the only material. There was vulcanite type of hardened rubber and bog oak, which were less expensive but also black in color. Even glass was sometimes used, tinted or painted black. The key requirement was that the jewelry present a muted, sorrowful appearance, no shiny gold filigree or bright gemstones. The idea was to reflect grief in every detail. Over time, a hierarchy of materials emerged. Whitby jet was considered the most refined. Bog oak and vulcanite were middle tier, and cheap imitations abounded for the lower classes. Yet, all served the same purpose: to keep a piece of the deceased close and to broadcast to the world that you were in mourning. Imagine an evening gathering. Nothing too lively, of course, since half the attendees are in mourning. You notice a woman's earrings catching the gaslight just so, revealing their carved jet design. Maybe they depict a weeping willow, a popular mourning symbol, or an urn. Another classic icon of loss. She wears a matching brooch pinned to her high collar, and it too features a miniature urn motif with a tiny glass window for hair. You might marvel at the artistry, but you also sense a heavy atmosphere. These accessories aren't for showiness, but for remembrance. If you tried to crack a joke about gloomy bling, well, you'd likely earn yourself a swift glare. There's your third joke, though hopefully you'll keep it to yourself if you actually time-traveled. Another point that stands out is how these pieces often got repurposed. If you move from deep mourning to half mourning, you might swap out your heavier jet pieces for something slightly less somber. Maybe a cameo carved from black shell with subtle white detailing. The cameo might depict a classical figure or an angel, still within the bounds of somber appropriateness. Sometimes, these cameo lockets even contained compartments for photos or hair. So, the entire collection of mourning jewelry could rotate in and out, depending on which stage of sorrow you found yourself in. A continuous wardrobe of deathly accessories. You can almost see a Victorian mother opening a jewelry chest labeled Deep Mourning, Second Mourning, and Memorial Only. If she discovered her teenage daughter rooting through the deep mourning drawer just to feel grown up, it might lead to quite the scolding. It's not just women who wore these tokens either. Men occasionally donned mourning rings, cufflinks, or watch fobs made from black materials or hair. Think of a gentleman pulling out his pocket watch at a railway station, the chain glinting darkly against his waistcoat. Perhaps a small compartment in the watch fob contains a photograph or a lock of his departed father's hair. It's a subtle statement, but one that Victorians would recognize instantly. The symbols were ubiquitous, each piece proclaiming, "I carry my grief with me." As you examine the final trinket, a pendant shaped like a tiny coffin with a hinged lid, you can't help but reflect on the emotional weight of these possessions. Did they truly bring comfort, or did they serve as constant reminders of heartbreak, making it impossible to move on? Victorians seemed determined to anchor themselves to the memory of the dead, yet in doing so, they enveloped their present moments with a constant whisper of mortality. Maybe it was a collective coping mechanism in an age when death came calling more often, thanks to diseases and limited medical knowledge. Or maybe, as some argue, it was a cultural fixation on the afterlife that helped everyone feel a little closer to the ones they'd lost. And so you set the pendant down, careful not to let its tiny lid clink too loudly. In the back of your mind, you wonder what it would be like to wear such jewelry today. Perhaps it's not so different from keeping old photographs in lockets or memorial tattoos. The impulse to remember, to hold on to tangible fragments of a loved one, remains universal, even if the Victorians took it to an extreme with their hair wreaths and carved jet brooches. Stepping away from that table of dark adornments, you sense the hush of the room as though the very walls are holding their breath in respect. Each ornament feels imbued with a story, some tragic, some comforting, and all undeniably connected to the reality of grief. In this moment, you see how Victorians turned loss into an art form, weaving sorrow into beauty, fashion, and symbolism. It's a reminder that, for all the heaviness, there was also a tenderness in these gestures, a wish to keep loved ones near, even beyond the veil of death. Leaving behind the gleam of jet jewelry, you step into a corridor where time itself seems measured out in shades of black, grey, and lavender. The floor creaks beneath your feet, as if reminding you that Victorian mourning was no fleeting gesture. It was a carefully orchestrated parade of garments, charting the journey from raw grief to the cautious re-emergence of colour. You walk past a series of wardrobes, each containing dresses that mark distinct phases of mourning. In the first is the deepest black, then the black with minimal trimming, then the dull greys, and finally the soft lilacs and lavenders of half mourning. Picture yourself waking one morning in a Victorian home, checking a calendar, or perhaps the household ledger. where someone has carefully calculated how many months have passed since the family member's death. 7 months in, you might mutter, time to trim some of the veil. The notion feels odd to modern sensibilities, but for the Victorians it was a sign of adhering to societal expectations. The strict timelines went roughly like this. After the funeral, one entered deep mourning, or full mourning, for several months, sometimes up to a year. During this period, the color palette was all-consuming black, often with harsh, matte fabrics like crapé or bombazine. Eventually, you'd shift to second mourning, in which fabrics could be a little lighter and perhaps a glimmer of subdued trim was allowed. After yet more time, you might reach half mourning, which permitted shades of grey lavender or even faint touches of white. And once enough time had passed, some people insisted on a full 2 years, while others were more lenient. You could finally, gingerly, reintroduce more color into your wardrobe. You might chuckle imagining a Victorian aunt brandishing a measuring tape, ensuring your hem is still sufficiently black. That's your first joke. Someone's got to keep you from sneaking red ribbons too soon. But that's not far off from reality. Entire etiquette books prescribe precisely how long each mourning stage should last, especially for immediate relatives like spouses or parents. It was more flexible for distant cousins or acquaintances, but the principle remained: you must visually demonstrate your grief, and the timeline for doing so was preordained by custom. A mainstream historical fact underscores how seriously these guidelines were taken. In 1861, when Prince Albert died, Queen Victoria officially set a precedent for the upper classes. She stayed in heavy mourning far longer than the norm, essentially altering the public's expectations. While people had followed similar patterns before, her example deepened the cultural assumption that if you truly loved the deceased, you'd maintain the darkest attire for extended periods. Though not everyone wore black for years, the monarchy's influence reverberated through society, bolstering the notion that visible, sustained mourning was the pinnacle of respectability. Historians still argue whether these rigid timelines fostered a healthier emotional process or merely forced people into a mechanical routine. Some scholars suggest that the step-by-step approach, darkest black to lighter black, then grey or lavender, mirrored the stages of healing, giving mourners a structured way to emerge from sorrow. Others believe it was more about social policing, a way to ensure you didn't appear indifferent or disrespectful. Failure to adhere meant inviting gossip or worse, ostracism. As you glide your hand over a row of dresses in ever-lightening hues, you sense the weight of those expectations. Each color shift wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a public declaration that you were a little less sad now. Hovering near a half-mourning dress, a gentle shade of mauve, you notice a subtle, almost dainty floral trim. It's not the bright florals we'd wear today, more like muted embroidery or a bit of black lace shaped into blossom. Even so, it marks a sea change. Where before everything was severe, flat black, now there's a hint of decoration, a suggestion that life goes on, albeit quietly. This is where you might allow small pieces of jewelry beyond just onyx or jet. Perhaps a cameo set in black metal, or even pearls if you were feeling daring. For many Victorian women, this stage felt like breaking a long fast, sampling life's color again. But it wasn't necessarily easy. Stepping out in anything but black could lead to whispered remarks from neighbors. There's your second joke. Imagine your neighbor across the fence, eyes widened. Is that a grey ribbon in your hair? My word, scandalous. Men, of course, had fewer color phases to juggle. A black suit is a black suit, so they transition more subtly, perhaps dropping the black armband after a certain period or shifting from the black cravat to a slightly patterned one. But for women, each progression involved a small drama: unveiling a new fabric, adjusting the veil, or deciding if it was finally acceptable to show a bit of white trim at the cuffs. Indeed, entire articles in women's magazines debated the best point at which to transition from second mourning to half mourning, usually referencing some nebulous, appropriate time that might vary by region and by your relationship to the deceased. One quirky tidbit that might amuse you is the phenomenon of mauve mania. In the mid-19th century, chemist William Henry Perkin accidentally discovered the dye mauveine, which quickly became popular because it was a striking but not overly bright color. For a while, it flooded fashion trends in general. But for the mourning crowd, mauve offered a perfect half-mourning shade, soft enough not to seem disrespectful, yet definitively lighter than black or grey. Some historians note that the timing of mauveine's discovery coincided almost too perfectly with the Victorian fixation on half-mourning. Demand soared, and countless women stepped out in dusty purple gowns, relieved to have a color that signaled, still sad but on the mend. Who knew a lab accident could shape the grieving wardrobes of a generation? Even children weren't exempt from these phased transitions. You might spot a little girl initially dressed in black calico following a grandparent's death. After months passed, she might be allowed a grey pinafore, then perhaps a lilac sash. The logic behind this is both heartbreaking and methodical. Children learn from a young age that grief is a public display, governed by specific rules. They might not fully understand the emotional underpinnings, but they certainly grasp the routine. We wear black for a while, then we wear not so black. Of course, even with these formal stages, not everyone adhered to them with the same diligence. Some families truncated the process if finances were tight or if they simply didn't believe in drawn-out displays of sorrow. Others extended it far longer, perhaps due to personal conviction or fear of social judgment. Imagine a widow who never moves past the second stage, retaining a veil for years beyond what society usually expects. People might whisper about her being stuck in the past, or, conversely, praise her loyalty to her spouse's memory. Amid this labyrinth of color-coded grief, you reflect on the emotional toll. For some, each shift in wardrobe could be a small victory, a lightening of the burden. For others, it might feel forced. Okay, so at 6 months, I'm allowed to wear white lace at the cuff. But what if I'm not ready to feel less miserable? The timeline might not sync with a person's true emotional journey. There's your third joke. Imagine a Victorian therapist prescribing, "Take 2 black crepe gowns and call me when you're ready for mauve." With one last look at the rows of dresses, you let your fingertips linger on a gown that hovers between black and grey, maybe a charcoal color. It's in that transitional zone, neither fully mournful nor entirely relieved of sorrow. The fabric is worn, suggesting its owner might have clung to this stage for a while, perhaps reluctant to move on or uncertain about the social repercussions. This garment, in its ambiguity, captures the complexity of Victorian mourning culture, a tension between genuine feeling and the rules imposed by society. The very idea that your emotional state should be publicly scheduled, measured in dyed silk and lace, can feel both comforting and stifling. Stepping away, you imagine a Victorian woman in half-mourning, finally reaching for a gentle pink garment in her wardrobe, an act of quiet defiance against the ocean of black. Maybe she faces the mirror, heart pounding, wondering if it's too soon or if she can finally exhale. It's a poignant image, reminding you that beneath all these fabrics and prescribed timelines lies an intensely human story: love, loss, and the need to navigate both within the confines of a tightly regulated culture. And with that reflection, you drift onward, leaving behind the kaleidoscope of subdued colors that mark the slow, formal dance from grief's darkest night to the cautious dawn of renewed life. Stepping beyond the subtle shifts of half-mourning and into the broader world outside, you find yourself in a realm where the daily rhythms of life are overshadowed by an all-pervasive insistence on hushed decorum. The black-clad community you've been exploring doesn't stop at personal attire. It spills out onto the streets, into carriages, and even onto the horses themselves. You watch as a long funeral procession rolls by, each carriage draped in black crepe, every occupant dressed in muted tones. It's as though the entire city has turned down its volume, out of respect for the recently departed. At the head of this somber caravan are jet black horses, their harnesses and reins adorned with long, flowing black ribbons. In some cases, those ribbons brush the ground, symbolic of the heaviness of the grief being borne. Imagine the challenge of keeping those ribbons from tangling or dragging in mud. Victorians could be meticulous, but the weather wasn't always so cooperative. Still, the sight of these darkly outfitted horses adds to the mystique, transforming an already solemn occasion into a public statement of mourning. You recall a friend joking, "They've even dressed the horses for the funeral. At least they didn't try to teach them to cry." See, there's your first joke. Although picturing a horse dabbing its eyes with a black lace handkerchief might offer a peculiar sense of comic relief, a mainstream historical fact emerges here. Many wealthy Victorians went to extravagant lengths to display grief, sometimes employing mutes, professional mourners who walked alongside the hearse in complete silence, signaling deep sorrow. More ostentatious funerals might include multiple black-plumed horses and entire retinues of attendants, each costumed in black garments. The unspoken rule was that the level of display reflected not only the depth of loss, but also the status of the deceased. Hence, a duke's funeral could look like a grand parade, while a modest family might settle for a single horse-drawn hearse with a few black ribbons. Regardless of scale, the solemn aesthetic remained consistent. making it clear that Victorians believed death deserved a public performance of respect. But it wasn't merely funerals that brought this hush to city streets. During heavy mourning periods, even casual conversations were expected to be subdued. Picture a bustling London thoroughfare where, instead of boisterous chatter, passers-by speak in measured tones. Shopkeepers might greet you politely but keep the volume low. You'd rarely hear the hearty laughter that might otherwise echo near an alehouse. It's as if everyone senses an invisible sign: tread gently, for sorrow is near. Perhaps you find this oppressive, or maybe you appreciate the collective empathy at work. Either way, the hush is palpable. Of course, not everyone followed these norms to the same degree. A quirky tidbit you stumble upon in rural areas: some families were far less strict about draping their horses or maintaining a near-funereal hush. They might adopt basic mourning attire and hold a respectful funeral, but they didn't necessarily transform the entire farm into a scene from a Gothic romance. One local farmer might keep a black cloth over the barn door for a few weeks, while his neighbor simply put on a dark armband. Urban visitors might raise an eyebrow at this seemingly lax approach, murmuring that proper mourning wasn't being observed, and yet life in the countryside often demanded practicality over elaborate rituals. You couldn't afford to let harvest duties slide because you were too busy coordinating a bevy of black-ribboned horses. Historians still argue whether these urban-rural discrepancies were a sign of class divisions, a question of available resources, or perhaps just differing cultural priorities. Some claim the Victorian fixation on showy mourning was mostly an upper and middle-class phenomenon, fueled by the desire to demonstrate social standing. Others suggest that even modest households in the city felt pressured by neighbors to conform, while rural folks had fewer such pressures. The reality was likely a blend: class, geography, and personal conviction all played into how far you'd go with black horses and muted conversation. In the midst of these constraints, black, draped mourning coaches stood out as particularly dramatic symbols. These carriages, decked in shiny black paint and adorned with black velvet or crepe, often featured decorative silver fittings that caught the light in stark contrast to the inky background. If you close your eyes, you can imagine the slow clop of hooves, the muffled clatter of carriage wheels, and the nearly reverent silence of bystanders as the procession passes. Even the driver might be dressed in black livery, complete with gloves and a tall hat trimmed with somber ribbon. If you were in one of these coaches, you'd likely feel the hush pressing in on you, a communal acknowledgement of loss. There's your second joke. Though I'd hate to be the coachman who accidentally wore navy blue instead of black, only to find himself the talk of the town for a week. In society's eyes, every detail had meaning. A carriage without enough black drapery might suggest a lack of proper respect. Too much drapery could appear gaudy or insincere. The sweet spot was a perfectly balanced look that conveyed grief without tipping into melodrama. This was no small feat, considering the unpredictability of the weather. Imagine how quickly a heavy rain could ruin carefully arranged crepe. Yet people persisted, determined to display mourning as meticulously as they would done it on their own bodies. Meanwhile, social gatherings in mourning households were a delicate dance of etiquette. If you were invited to a post-funeral reception, you'd expect low voices, minimal music, see if any, and definitely no dancing. Refreshments might be served, but they'd likely be subdued. Tea, plain biscuits, perhaps simple sandwiches. Anything more elaborate could be viewed as disrespectful. The conversation might revolve around the departed, memories, anecdotes, or quietly offered condolences. One might compare these receptions to a sad tea party. So there's your third joke, like a tea party where the sugar bowl is replaced with gloom. But for Victorians, it was a sincere opportunity to pay respects. You get the impression that the entire community participated in a shared performance, each person playing their role to uphold the decorum of the time. It wasn't always about personal grief. Sometimes it was simply about doing what was right by societal standards. A shopkeeper might hang black bunting over his storefront if a prominent local figure died, even if he barely knew the deceased. A family might avoid throwing parties for months after a funeral, not because they felt no joy, but because they feared community judgment. In this sense, mourning rituals acted like a social contract. Everyone knew the lines and cues. As you stand at the edge of a cobbled street, watching another black coach rumble by, you sense both the weight and the solidarity in these customs. Yes, they enforced a certain conformity, yet they also made grief something openly acknowledged, shared through attire and public displays. Perhaps this collective hush was a way to ensure no one's sorrow passed unnoticed. but you also imagine the strain of maintaining such an atmosphere, especially if you were someone who longed for a dash of color or a hearty laugh now and then. Indeed, it must have been a delicate balance, respecting the departed while keeping life's pulse alive beneath the black ribbons. With the procession fading around a corner, you find yourself stepping back from the curb, letting the subtle rumble of carriage wheels recede into the distance. The hush lingers, as if the street itself remains suspended between the living and the departed. And in that quiet moment, you might wonder whether this elaborate choreography of coaches, black horses, and muted exchanges truly provided solace, or if it sometimes became an oppressive backdrop against which genuine emotion was stifled. Either way, the legacy is clear. In the Victorian era, mourning wasn't just a private matter. It was a public tableau, complete with stage directions, prescribed costumes, and an unspoken rule that even the horses had to look the part. Stepping off the hushed street where black horses and somber carriages dominate, you find yourself drawn into a more boisterous realm, a place buzzing with printed pages and lively caricatures. Yes, this is the Victorian world of tabloids, satirical magazines, and gossip columns, where the eccentricities of mourning fashion came under frequent, if irreverent, scrutiny. You wander into a cramped London newsstand, your eyes skimming past rows of broadsheets featuring bold headlines about politics, crime, and society's latest scandals. Amid them, you spot copies of satirical publications like Punch and lesser-known penny papers, each eager to poke fun at the unending parade of black creep. You pick up a periodical and flip through its pages. There, in an exaggerated cartoon, you see a caricature of a widow wearing a veil so long she can't possibly walk without tripping, followed closely by a trail of small dogs all entangled in her black ribbons. That's your first joke. Clearly, it's a comedic take on just how impractical those voluminous veils could be. The caption reads something like, "Lady's latest mourning mishap. Even the Pomeranians pay the price." It's outlandish, but behind the humor lies a hint of social critique. People were starting to question whether the elaborate mourning displays had gone too far, especially among the wealthier classes who seemed to compete for who could appear the most bereaved. You leaf through another page and stumble upon an advertisement parodying the booming mourning industry, a fictional shop that offers exclusive ebony petticoats and weeping veil extensions, guaranteed to flutter in the lightest breeze. The punchline suggests that grieving is now a marketplace. Any sorrow you have can be made more authentic for the right price. You recall that Victorian-era tabloids often thrived on sensationalism, and nothing tickled their fancy quite like pointing out the contradictions of a society that demanded ultra-serious mourning while also using it as a form of conspicuous consumption. A mainstream historical fact creeps into your mind. By the mid-19th century, literacy rates in Britain were on the rise, and cheaper printing methods fueled the circulation of newspapers, pamphlets, and cartoons. This made it easier for satirists and caricaturists to reach a broad audience. Titles like Punch became wildly popular, shaping public opinion through wit and ridicule. Mourning customs were too juicy a target to ignore, especially when influential figures like Queen Victoria set the tone by wearing black for decades. The comedic gold lay in how everyday families mimicked the Queen, often straining their budgets to keep up with the royal standard of grief. As you browse another corner of the newsstand, you notice smaller gossip rags offering salacious tidbits. Perhaps a widow was seen enjoying a hearty meal before her year of mourning was fully up, or someone dared to introduce violet trim into her black dress prematurely. Such scandals might be accompanied by snide remarks or cheeky commentary, urging readers to tut or giggle behind folded pages. There's your second joke. Imagine the headline, "Local Adobe CSAGGM 8011 Mo OGENCUES." Victorian caricaturists also relished lampooning men's mourning practices. One drawing might depict a gentleman wearing a black band on each arm, plus one on his top hat, plus black gloves, clearly overdoing it in an effort to appear properly solemn. The exaggerated tears in his eyes might be labeled crocodile tears, suggesting that some men feigned deeper grief than they felt, all for social kudos. Naturally, the same cartoon might feature a crowd of onlookers, each with a thought bubble reading, "He's doing it for the inheritance," or "Now that's a bit much, isn't it?" Historians still argue whether these satirical portrayals genuinely influenced public attitudes or simply confirmed what many already thought, that some aspects of Victorian mourning customs were ripe for parody. On one hand, by mocking the extremes, these magazines could spark conversation, perhaps nudging society toward moderating certain practices. On the other hand, the satire often coexisted with deep, deep-seated respect for tradition. After all, people might laugh at a cartoon depicting a super extended veil, but that didn't necessarily mean they'd forego wearing their own. Rituals around death carried emotional weight. Many mourners found genuine solace in them, even as the satirists sharpened their pens. Still, the gossips didn't limit themselves to ridiculing fashion alone. They also pounced on the hypocrisy lurking beneath some individuals' public displays of sorrow. A quirky tidbit you hear about in these tabloids: rumors circulated that certain socialites used their mourning period as an excuse to dodge events they found tedious, only to turn up at exclusive gatherings, coincidentally dressed in slightly lighter mourning, which allowed them just enough wiggle room to attend. Tabloid writers latched onto these stories, painting them as comedic examples of how mourning could be manipulated to suit personal convenience. Pausing at a cafe table, you scan an article from a gossip column that details the scandalous behavior of a young widow who, less than 6 months after her husband's passing, was spotted wearing half mourning lavender to a theatrical performance. The piece is dripping with sarcasm, implying that her sorrow couldn't have been very deep if she was able to watch a comedy show with a modest smile on her lips. You can almost envision the eye roll of the writer as they pen each line, fully aware that the public thrives on such tidbits, like a Victorian version of today's tabloid paparazzi shots. There's your third joke. Widow wears lavender. Must be laughing all the way to the altar. Might be a typical sensationalist headline. Beneath the jibes, however, lies a cultural tension. On one side, the era's moralists insisted that outward mourning practices were crucial for social decorum and respect for the dead. On the other, a growing chorus of critics labeled it competitive grieving, accusing families of turning funerals and mourning attire into self-glorifying spectacles. You sense that many Victorians harbored mixed feelings, both respecting the customs and finding them stifling or performative. The tabloids and caricatures simply amplified this contradiction for all to see, and perhaps to laugh about. You might wonder how people reacted upon being skewered by these publications. Receiving such ridicule could be mortifying for someone who prized their social standing. Yet, in an age without digital cameras or social media, one might hope the story would fade after a few days, unless it was scandalous enough to go viral in the 19th century sense, repeated in multiple papers and coffeehouses. Rich or poor, nobody was completely safe from the pen of a satirist who smelled hypocrisy or comedic potential in their approach to mourning. As you set down the paper and prepare to leave this world of ink and wit, you reflect on the odd function these critics served. By poking fun at the extremes, they forced society to reconsider how much of mourning was genuine emotion and how much was social theatre. Perhaps a few families decided not to bankrupt themselves on endless black crappie after reading a biting cartoon. Or maybe some fed up with being mocked, insisted even more strongly on their solemn rights. Whichever the case, these glimpses into Victorian tabloids reveal that even at the height of all black attire and strict etiquette, there was room for laughter, or at least a sardonic smile, at the absurdities that inevitably arise when grief becomes an unspoken competition. You step back into the street, the cool air brushing against you like a merciful exhale after the stifling intensity of gossip columns and punchy cartoons. Overhead, a grey sky stretches out, reminding you that real sorrow and social mockery often coexist in uneasy tension. In the distance, you spot another black, veiled figure hurrying along, perhaps oblivious to the satirists who might poke fun at her attire, and for a moment, you appreciate just how complicated this era could be, rife with genuine loss, heartfelt rituals, and a lively undercurrent of skepticism, all braided together under the banner of mourning. Stepping away from the snickering caricatures of Victorian tabloids, you walk down a side street where the dim glow of shop windows reveals a different reality: mourning as big business. Almost every window is filled with black, draped merchandise, yards of somber crepe, glossy jet jewelry, even custom memorial stationery. You pass a row of undertakers' parlors, their doors trimmed in black, each promising dignified funeral arrangements and the finest hearses. A whiff of candle wax and dust greets you as you enter one shop, the bell overhead tinkling softly. Inside, the walls are lined with an inventory that might surprise you: black gloves in various shades, some so dark they almost seem to swallow light, others with a faint charcoal hue, veils of different lengths, crepe ribbons, mourning brooches, and even ready-made widow's caps. If you pause to read the price tags, you'll notice they're not cheap. Grief, it turns out, can be quite profitable. A mild sense of unease bubbles up in you. These items aren't mere accessories, but symbols of loss, You wonder how it must feel for someone who has just lost a loved one to walk in and be greeted by a cheerful shopkeeper eager to discuss the latest must-have mourning paraphernalia. There's your first joke. Imagine a Victorian commercial. This season's trendiest veil! Because nothing says I miss you like top-quality crepe. One mainstream historical fact stands out amid these shelves. The 19th century saw a spike in specialized mourning warehouses, particularly in large cities like London. These establishments were one-stop shops for everything a family might need after a death. Clothing for the widow, suits for the men, outfits for the children, black ribbons for servants, even funeral wreaths and coffin adornments. With Queen Victoria's lengthy mourning contributing to the culture, countless families felt compelled to keep pace, fueling a demand that soared to unprecedented levels. You can almost hear the hush of the floorboards as customers arrive, drawn in by the promise of convenience during a painful time. But the hustle doesn't end with clothing. You tiptoe past a display of funereal stationery and heavy black edging, invitation cards for funerals, acknowledgement cards for condolences, and even mourning envelopes. There's something strangely efficient about it all, like a production line for heartbreak. If you needed to send out 100 notices of a loved one's passing, you'd purchase them here, pre-printed or tailor-made to include the deceased's name and date. For an extra fee, you could add a small black border, thick for a close relative, thinner for a more distant one. Talk about micro-managing grief. Yet in this era such distinctions felt vital. It was all about signaling the exact level of mourning you were in. Historians still argue whether this commodification of sorrow trivialized genuine emotions or offered practical help during times of loss. Some see the Victorian mourning industry as exploitative, a way to profit off people's vulnerability, especially since social pressure meant that not following the prescribed etiquette could bring shame. Others contend that these specialized shops provided invaluable services. Death was commonplace, and many families lacked the time or know how to create mourning garments themselves. By stepping into a mourning emporium, they could handle all the daunting logistics under one roof, letting them focus on their emotional needs, at least in theory. Drifting farther into the store, you reach a modest corner where a dressmaker's dummy stands draped in an elaborate black lace gown. A curious plaque lists its features: full, mourning crepe with optional jet embellishments, available in 3 payment plans. You notice a discreet sign behind the dummy that reads, "Ask about our crepe cleaning service." Because, of course, black crepe can be a nightmare to maintain. It's notoriously fragile, prone to water spotting, and nearly impossible to clean without destroying the fabric's texture. This shop is ready to upsell you on its in-house cleaners, ensuring you won't ruin your solemn garb after just one wear. A quirky tidbit: some of these mourning supply shops also employed professionals who would coach grieving families on the correct etiquette. How to curtsy when offering condolences, how long a widow should keep her veil down, and which floral arrangements were most suitable. Imagine an entire job dedicated to teaching people to carry their sorrow correctly. There's your second joke. Mourning consultant. Might read well on a business card, but you'd have to wonder if the job description includes measuring tears per hour. Undertakers also flourished in this bustling market. They offered graduated funeral packages, from basic pine coffins to elaborate affairs with silver, plated handles, plush linings, and black horses decked out in ornamental plumes. The biggest spenders might insist on a glass, panelled hearse so that onlookers could pay respects, or gawk at the casket within. And let's not forget, funeral mutes, those silent attendants who followed the procession. Their very presence a solemn advertisement for the family's grief. The bigger and more theatrical your funeral, the more status you displayed. An odd twist on the notion of rest in peace. Stepping through a side door, you enter a small workshop area. The faint aroma of heated metal and varnish tells you this is where skilled artisans craft coffin fittings. Handles, nameplates, decorative studs. You watch a man carefully engraving a brass plate with the name of the deceased, his steady hand honed by years of turning sorrow into precise lettering. Nearby, a woman stitches black trim onto a veiled hat meant for the deceased's mother. The hum of industry continues unabated, as though sadness itself is the raw material fueling every hammer blow and every stitch. Pausing at a nearby table, you see a ledger filled with orders. 1 black bonnet with crepe veil, size medium for Mrs. T. 2 dozen black gloves for pallbearers at the Harrison funeral. Each line item reads like a mini tragedy, but the shop staff treat it as routine business. That's the peculiar thing about the mourning trade. You're face to face with death, but it becomes day-to-day work. A third joke crosses your mind. Maybe these workers sometimes slip and refer to an item as the hottest new style in sorrow, only to catch themselves and remember that no one is meant to be happy about these purchases. Outside, on the street, you notice some competition. Another shop boasts a fashionable mourning salon. Your grief, our priority. While yet another advertises discount bundles for entire households. It's as if each proprietor vies for a slice of the grief-stricken market. For the poorer classes who couldn't afford lavish displays, there were also second-hand mourning garments, or they'd simply dye older clothes black as a makeshift solution. That might be frowned upon by stricter social circles, but it was practical in an era when purchasing brand new outfits for each stage of mourning could bankrupt a family. All this commerce hinges on a strict set of unspoken rules. You're expected to show your grief, and you're expected to do it the right way. Failing to participate, or half participating, might lead to raised eyebrows, gossip, or outright censure. At the same time, stepping too far into extravagance could invite ridicule or a satirical cartoon in the local rag. The delicate balance keeps everyone on their toes: mourners, businessmen, and even the general public, which watches and judges. As you exit the shop, the bell overhead rings once more, and you reflect on how seamlessly the Victorians integrated grief into the marketplace. It's neither purely cynical nor entirely compassionate. It's a complex dance between supply and demand, tradition and necessity. In this era, death was frequent enough that an entire infrastructure developed to cater to it. For some families, these services offered genuine relief. For others, it must have felt like a burden. One more societal hoop to jump through in the wake of losing a loved one. You linger on the threshold, recalling the sight of rows upon rows of black garments, each one silently telling a story of sorrow and commerce locked in a waltz. It's a jarring realization that in Victorian times, mourning wasn't just a private emotion or a public duty. It was also a thriving industry. Even as you step away from the storefront, you can't escape the knowledge that every piece of black fabric, every lacquered coffin handle, and every weeping veil is part of a bigger machine, one that runs on the universal inevitability of death. And that, in itself, might be the most haunting truth of all. Leaving behind the bustling commerce of London's mourning emporiums, you venture farther afield, curious about how these solemn customs played out beyond the capital's well-lit streets. It doesn't take long before you find yourself in a quiet countryside lane, its hedgerows swaying in a gentle breeze. The black attire you've come to expect seems less ubiquitous here. Instead, you notice villagers paying their respects in more understated ways. Perhaps a simple black ribbon pinned to a shawl, or a band of crepe around a farmer's hat. You feel the difference immediately. There's a sense of practicality, as though while they honor the departed, they also have crops to tend or livestock to feed. Stepping onto the worn threshold of a modest cottage, you're greeted by the faint aroma of peat smoke. Inside, a small gathering lingers, each person dressed in dark clothing but not necessarily head-to-toe bombazine. A widow, her eyes rimmed red, wears a patched black apron over her usual dress. Another relative sports a black armband that looks homemade, perhaps dyed in someone's wash basin rather than purchased from a fancy shop. It's a stark contrast to the elaborate city funerals you've witnessed, but no less heartfelt. Indeed, you catch murmured comments about how each neighbor contributed something. A few coins for funeral expenses, an extra yard of cloth for the widow's dress. This communal approach feels comforting, a softer echo of the grand Victorian mourning rituals. A mainstream historical fact bubbles up while London and other major cities imposed strict social codes for mourning attire. Rural communities often followed older, more localized traditions. In some parts of Britain, especially in the north, and in certain pockets of Ireland, families chose minimal black garments combined with local folk customs, like stopping the clock at the exact time of death or covering mirrors with dark cloth to keep spirits from lingering. These superstitions mingle seamlessly with Christian rites, forming an eclectic tapestry of beliefs around death. You're ushered into a small parlor where the hush of grief is punctuated by occasional laughter. Yes, laughter, as relatives recount stories of the departed's youthful escapades. In this community, it seems acceptable, even expected, to share a few fond, amusing anecdotes during the mourning period. Someone might gently tease, "Old Thomas never missed a market day unless there was free beer somewhere else." That's your first joke. Imagine folks nodding in agreement, a warm chuckle offsetting the sorrow. They do still wear black or dark grey, but the atmosphere feels more intimate, less staged. Still, you detect certain superstitions that might raise an eyebrow among urban Victorians. For instance, one villager insists on leaving a window open when someone passes away, allowing the soul to leave the house unimpeded. Another claims you mustn't rock an empty cradle, lest you invite restless spirits. These practices blend seamlessly with the mourning rituals, forming a local matrix of beliefs that might seem puzzling to someone who's only read about the official protocols in city etiquette guides. Historians still argue whether these traditions represent a purer, older form of mourning, or whether they're merely rural eccentricities that coexisted with the more formal Victorian codes. Stepping back outside, you follow a winding path toward a small churchyard. The headstones lean slightly, as if dozing beneath mossy coverings. You hear the rustle of wind through the grass and catch sight of crows perched on a weathered fence, an image so quintessentially Gothic that you can't help but grin. There's your second joke. Cue the dramatic thunderclap, as if a Victorian novelist orchestrated the perfect spooky backdrop. You notice that fresh graves here are often marked by simple wooden crosses draped with black cloth, sometimes pinned with wildflowers. It's neither lavish nor Spartan. Somewhere in between, as though each family does what it can with the resources at hand. In other regions, say, among the Scottish Highlands, you might encounter the custom of bagpipes playing a dirge at the funeral, the mournful strains echoing across misty hills. The black attire remains, but with a twist, kilts in sombre tartans, perhaps accented by black ribbons. Alternatively, in parts of Wales, the chapel community might gather to sing Welsh hymns in soft, harmonious voices. The sense of unity is palpable. You can almost feel your own heart catching in your throat as the music washes over the congregation. While city dwellers might find these practices too rustic or overly sentimental, they carry a deep resonance for the locals, who merge cultural identity with mourning rituals. As you wander on, you uncover a quirky tidbit specific to certain fishing villages along the coast. If a fisherman passed away at sea, local wives would wear black shawls embroidered with tiny anchor motifs, a subtle nod to the maritime life. A child might wear a small anchor pin or a rope, like bracelet dyed black. It's a communal way of acknowledging the sea's role in their loss. That's your third joke, though perhaps not so funny for those who dreaded the sea's unpredictability. You might imagine a modern twist. We lost Uncle Joe in the North Sea, so our black outfits come with bonus salt stains. Moving further into the countryside, you encounter travelers' tales of odd rituals that some say ward off vengeful spirits. One story goes that in a certain hamlet, mourners place sprigs of rosemary at the windows of a house in mourning to keep ghosts at bay, all while maintaining the usual black attire. You see a cluster of rosemary plants near a doorstep, their pungent scent drifting up in the cool air. You imagine the mixture of old pagan customs and Victorian grief etiquette, swirling together like two streams converging into one river. Throughout your journey, you notice that while urban Victorians might have had the financial means to change wardrobes at each stage of mourning, country folk often had to improvise. Some simply dyed their existing clothes black or a dark grey, then re-dyed them again into lighter shades if they advanced to half-mourning. These repeated dye jobs sometimes produced mismatched or blotchy outfits, likely fodder for gossip if a city matron spotted them. Yet here, nobody seems to mind. They understand that outward appearances, while important, should never trump genuine grief. The differences aren't purely economic either. In some parishes, the local priest or minister might be stricter about decorum during church services, insisting that widows keep their veils lowered for a certain length of time. In others, religious leaders might emphasize spiritual comfort over visual conformity, focusing on prayer gatherings instead of elaborate funeral processions. You can almost picture a traveling preacher crossing from one county to another, trying to navigate these varied mourning customs without offending anyone. With the setting sun painting the sky in dusky purples, ironically reminiscent of half-mourning, you find yourself on a small farmstead where a wake is in progress. The deceased was an elderly matriarch, beloved by the community. Though the family follows many Victorian conventions, black attire, subdued conversation, they also honor local law by placing a candle in each window, guiding her spirit home. Mourners share a simple meal of bread, cheese and ale. A moment of laughter emerges when someone recalls how the old woman once dyed a sheep black just for fun, to see if it could pass as a mourning outfit for a village festival. It's tender and slightly absurd, but perfectly in tune with the night's solemn yet warm mood. Standing on the edge of that wake, you sense that the official Victorian guidelines on mourning have been adapted, shaped by geography, economics, and centuries of regional law. You imagine returning to a London drawing room and trying to explain the blend of superstition and modest practicality you've witnessed. City folk might shake their heads, murmuring, "Quaint," or "How bizarre," while the rural families would likely shrug and say, "It's just our way." Neither is wholly right or wrong. Both reflect different strands of the same cultural tapestry. Perhaps that's the real beauty in these variations. They remind you that even amid strict societal norms, people find ways to express sorrow in a manner that feels authentic to their life and land. The lane darkens as you take your leave, the soft crunch of gravel beneath your feet mirroring the subdued farewell offered by the villagers. No grand hearses decked in black ribbons here, just worn boots, sturdy hearts, and old beliefs passed down through generations. You walk on, carrying a deeper appreciation for how mourning, while universal, can manifest in countless forms, each whispering its own truth about how best to honor the dead. You find yourself back in the heart of Victorian society, standing in a drawing room furnished with polished wood and draped with subdued fabrics. The candles flicker, casting elongated shadows against the wallpaper, and the conversation you overhear centers on just one topic: how long is long enough? A hushed tension fills the room as a small circle of ladies, each in varying stages of black or grey attire, debates the correct duration of mourning. One insists that a full year for a parent is the bare minimum. Another argues for a more lenient 6-month period, especially if finances are tight. A third, clad in half mourning lavender, notes that Queen Victoria mourned Prince Albert for decades, thereby raising everyone's expectations. The crux of the matter soon emerges. Historians still argue whether these elaborate timelines were too burdensome or simply tradition. After all, the rigid funeral, to mourning's schedule with its detailed phases, had an inescapable social weight. Fail to wear deep black for an appropriate amount of time, and you'd face scornful whispers. Extend your mourning beyond social norms, and you risked eye rolls or accusations of affectation. It was like an unwritten code dictating that if you didn't publicly display your grief, you might as well not be grieving at all. Or conversely, if you displayed it too loudly and too long, people questioned your motives. One mainstream historical fact sets the stage. By the mid-19th century, a widowed woman was commonly expected to wear full mourning for at least 1 year and a day, sometimes longer for a particularly beloved or high-status spouse. Yet the unofficial rules varied, shaped by region, class, and the depth of one's pocketbook. In some circles, you'd be forgiven for lightening your dress after 6 months if you were struggling financially. Others demanded strict adherence, no matter the cost. Because, ironically, neglecting full mourning might bring an even bigger financial hit if society snubbed your business or patronage. You picture the mental gymnastics each family had to perform. Perhaps they were terrified of being perceived as callous or disrespectful, so they kept the crape and the black ribbons in play for extra months. Or maybe they were relieved to shorten the mourning period, hoping to lighten the emotional and financial burden. All the while their neighbors, colleagues, and social acquaintances watched, tallying the days, judging each sartorial choice. There's your first joke. Imagine a pocket watch that counts mourning days, instead of minutes, chiming ominously when you dare to think about wearing mauve too soon. In the same parlor, an older gentleman with a grey beard holds forth on a different angle men's mourning durations. He chides the ladies for their stringent codes, noting that he only wore a black armband for 6 weeks after losing a cousin. Yet no one seemed to mind. This disparity prompts murmurs. Was it fair that men could more freely exit their mourning period without backlash, while women were expected to endure lengthy multi-stage displays? One lady snaps her fan shut in mild annoyance, pointing out how unfair it feels that society excuses men, but demands ladies remain in the penitent black for months on end. A younger woman in half mourning glances around nervously and offers a quirky tidbit. She'd read about a debate in the newspapers suggesting that mourning periods might be detrimental to industry, as they stifled normal social and economic life. Businesses lost customers, she explains, when families stayed shuttered indoors or spent less on non-mourning goods. Shopkeepers complained that the black dye industry was thriving while theirs faltered. Others countered that mourning was, in fact, a boost to certain sectors. Dressmakers, funeral supply shops, and carriage drapers made a tidy profit. Such public debates underscored the large-scale impact of grief on everyday commerce. Of course, in a corner of the parlor, a lone voice pipes up. Perhaps we could forego these prescriptions and allow each person to mourn in their own way. The reaction is immediate, a collective intake of breath, as though this suggestion borders on blasphemy. In an era when etiquette was a pillar of society, stepping outside the rules felt radical, even subversive. Yet you sense a growing undercurrent of impatience in the room, an unspoken feeling that these timelines might be anachronistic or overly harsh. There's your second joke. Someone might lean over and whisper, "We can't have that, dear," or "we'll have nothing left to gossip about." Some historians posit that the rise of more liberal ideas toward the end of the 19th century did begin to erode strict mourning durations. Younger generations bristled at the notion of wearing black for a year or more, especially if the deceased was a distant relative. They argued that grief was personal, not performative, and questioned why society should dictate how long they remained cloaked in sorrow. On the other hand, traditionalists clung to custom, insisting that communal displays of mourning fostered respect and unity in the face of loss. Then there's the intersection of mourning durations with religion. One lady in the parlor quietly recounts how her parish priest said a year of mourning for a parent was mandatory, reflecting both respect and a recognition of biblical themes about honoring one's father and mother. Another interrupts to say her minister suggested it was more important to pray and do charitable works than to wear black for an arbitrary stretch of months. Saintly deeds over somber dresses, she quotes, rolling her eyes at the memory. These differing religious perspectives only fuel more debate, layering another dimension onto the already complex societal rules. As you circle the room, you recall stories of wealthy families who hosted lavish mourning parties. Yes, parties. To mark the day when a widow could finally transition from deep mourning to second mourning, or from second mourning to half mourning. A final black ball, if you will, signaling that life could cautiously resume its social activities. You might raise an eyebrow at the irony of celebration of moving from black to grey, with all guests dressed accordingly, as if colour choices were cause for dancing. There's your third joke. Tonight's theme, 50 Shades of Black, could be the teasing tagline on the engraved invitation. But, for many, these transitions were quiet, often unremarked upon until someone noticed that the widow's veil had shortened or her sleeves had a hint of trim. Murmurs in church pews or around the dinner table would follow. "Did you see Mrs. So, and so's new lace collar? It's been 9 months already. I suppose she's within her rights." It was a constant tango between private grief and public approval. Some found that structure helpful, others found it suffocating, but almost everyone followed it to some degree. Stepping back, you catch sight of a black clock on the mantel, its steady ticking a fitting metaphor for how Victorians measured and discussed grief. Days, weeks, months. Each moment counted toward an invisible ledger of sorrow. Society peered over your shoulder, ensuring you didn't cut the process short or stretch it too long. In that sense, mourning durations became a collective negotiation, forever in flux. As the conversation in the parlor ebbs, one of the ladies rests her teacup on its saucer and sighs, admitting she's exhausted by the whole rigmarole. "My heart still aches every day," she says softly. "What difference does it make if my dress is black or grey? If my veil is down or lifted?" Her candor surprises the gathering. For a moment, no one knows how to respond. Maybe that's the quiet truth behind all these debates. Grief is rarely linear, and confining it to a schedule can feel both comforting and painfully artificial. You step away, letting that last comment echo in your thoughts. Perhaps the durations were both too burdensome and simply tradition. Two realities that coexisted in Victorian life. As you move to the next room, you sense that the era's hold on rigid timelines may begin to loosen soon, nudged by modern ideas and the fatigue of those who can't bear another day in scratchy black bombazine. Whether society will adapt quickly or cling to its black-clad calendar is anyone's guess, but the seeds of change are there, rustling beneath the surface of each hushed debate. You glide through a hallway whose wallpaper looks just a little brighter, the echo of your footsteps revealing subtle signs of change in the air. It feels as though a slight loosening has happened, like an invisible thread has been gently tugged free. The gloom of endless black bombazine is still present, but there's an undercurrent of questioning. You overhear two young cousins, leaning against a polished banister, whispering to each other about how long they really need to keep up the facade of heavy mourning for a distant relative. One shrugs and suggests they might quietly switch to dark greys in a month's time. Who would really know or care? Already, the tension between rigid tradition and personal preference is showing. You move on and find yourself in what appears to be a newly furnished sitting room. The windows are not heavily curtained. Instead, sunlight beams in, illuminating chairs upholstered in somber tones, but with a fresh, crisp pattern. You notice the occupant, a woman who's recently been widowed, tapping her fingers on a small table, as though caught between convention and her own restless spirit. Perhaps she's grown wary of the all-encompassing black that has cloaked her for months. She sighs, letting in a sliver of honest feeling. "I sometimes wonder," she mutters, "if Albert would have wanted me shut away like this." There it is, a quiet rebellion, the idea that maybe one's departed loved one wouldn't have insisted on endless crapi. You recall a mainstream historical fact. Around the latter half of the 19th century, especially after the 1860s and 1870s, British society began to see shifts in taste and etiquette. While Queen Victoria persisted in her perpetual mourning, younger generations, influenced by evolving ideas about individualism and modern progress, started to question the extremities of funeral pomp and elongated mourning. Newspaper editorials occasionally published pieces that wonder, why must we spend so many resources on black fabric when there are other pressing needs in our communities? And with urbanization and more cross-cultural interactions, particularly exposure to how Americans or continental Europeans handled mourning, some folks decided it might be time to pare down. Your steps lead you to a grand funeral that's taking place in the next room. But it's unlike the ones you've seen before. The casket, though still polished and stately, is adorned with fewer black draperies, and the floral arrangements feature white lilies in abundance. No sign of a giant black canopy overhead or an army of silent mutes. One older relative clutches her pearls, whispering that the family is hardly putting on a show, but you catch a hint of approval in her voice. It's as if she, too, has grown a bit wary of the pageantry. But that's your first joke. Maybe she's thinking, thank heavens we're not stuck untangling black ribbons from the horses' tails again. Historians still argue whether the reduction in funeral pomp was purely an economic decision or a sign of shifting cultural values. Some say it was prompted by practicalities, warmer weather, smaller spaces, or less disposable income. Others believe it reflected deeper philosophical changes, a growing sense that grief should be personal, not performed like a stage play. The truth likely sits somewhere between, driven by both the modern yearning for individual expression and the fatigue that comes with performing heartbreak on a public stage. Meanwhile, you overhear a group of young women chatting about the unbearable itch of creepy. Yes, the conversation is light-hearted, but it underscores something real: the physical discomfort of these thick, scratchy fabrics weighed on people for months. "If I have to scratch my neck one more time in church, I'll scream," jokes one young lady. There's your second joke, though her mother would probably hush her in horror if she actually did scream mid-sermon. The group giggles, then grows serious, admitting they don't see the point in wearing this cloth for a second cousin they hardly knew. Perhaps a modest black sash would suffice. You notice that photography has become cheaper and more accessible. People are beginning to rely on photographs rather than purely on memorial paintings or hair jewelry. As you peer at a small photo album on a side table, you see that some families choose a single, formal mourning shot, but then move on, not filling every page with black, edged corners. The shift is subtle, but telling. It's not that they don't grieve, but they don't feel the need to drench their entire daily lives in black for years. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you flip through the pictures a few families try. Post-mortem photography, capturing an image of their loved one, sometimes posed as if still alive. Yet even in that practice, you sense a gradual retreat from the more grisly or heavily staged setups that were once in vogue. Across the room, a clergyman quietly shares that he's relieved by the new trend towards simpler funerals. He confides in you that he's always found the excessive use of black draperies inside churches distracting. People fussing over them, adjusting them, worrying about whether the color was deep enough. We're meant to be focusing on eternal life and comfort. He says, not on who has the largest velvet swags. You sense that he's voicing an opinion that would have been considered radical a couple of decades earlier, but is gaining traction now. At a nearby table, you witness another moment that highlights the era's transformation: a widow removing her mourning veil after only 8 months, well before the traditional year mark. Gasps flutter around her, but nobody rushes to condemn her. It's too hot, she explains matter-of-factly. I need to look after my children without tripping over yards of lace. She wears a subdued grey dress, still respectful, but not stifling. The shift feels almost cathartic, and you detect more admiration than disapproval from onlookers. It's a small sign that those who break the old rules might be less likely to face a social guillotine than before. At the same time, not everyone approves. One older woman in the corner calls this relaxed attitude a disgrace, fanning herself and grumbling about how the younger generation has no respect for the dead. Some still believe that the elaborate mourning period is a hallmark of civilization, a testament to the depth of one's devotion. The debate plays out in murmured arguments along the hallways, some praising the relief of simpler funerals, others lamenting what they see as a loss of solemn dignity. There's your third joke. Imagine a sign reading, "Mind your mourning manners." Next generation not guaranteed to follow. With all these tensions swirling, you sense an inevitable transformation. Perhaps it won't happen overnight. Many people remain deeply attached to tradition, and Queen Victoria's example still looms large. But the seeds of change are sprouting, watered by practicality, personal comfort, and a shifting sense of identity in an industrializing world. The expansions of railways, factories, and global trade have brought in fresh perspectives, and, ironically, a faster-paced lifestyle that leaves less room for drawn-out rituals. As you drift toward the exit, you notice one final detail: a modest black bough pinned to a cloak stand, next to a letter from a friend overseas who mentions that in their town, mourning customs last only a few weeks. The letter's writer wonders why the English make such a fuss, inadvertently raising a question that resonates throughout the house. Are these extravagant displays truly necessary, or might genuine remembrance take other forms? Forms that don't require draping every surface in black? Stepping outside, you feel the air lift, as if the era itself is exiling. The sorrow-laden atmosphere doesn't vanish. It's still part of Victorian culture, but it's no longer as suffocating. There's a sense that time marches on, that new ideas are creeping into even the most tradition-bound corners. And as you stand there on the threshold, you realize you've just glimpsed the cusp of an evolution. The grand funerals and endless cry still persist, but a quieter, more personal way of grieving is beginning to bloom. Walking along a cobblestone avenue bathed in the late afternoon sun, you notice how the remnants of Victorian mourning fashion linger, quietly weaving themselves into the evolving tapestry of modern life. While you still spot the occasional black-clad figure tiptoeing through the streets, something else catches your eye: subtle echoes of this era in contemporary customs. From the black armbands worn by sports teams to commemorate a loss, to the sleek lines of a modern, little black dress, you begin to realize that the spirit of Victorian mourning hasn't vanished. It has simply shifted into different, often more understated forms. You pass by a modishly dressed individual wearing a sharply tailored black coat. It's not a mourning garment per se, but it calls to mind the elegant silhouettes Victorians used to proclaim grief. Even the concept of wearing black to a funeral remains a near-universal sign of respect, though usually without the layered crape and strict timeline. So that's your first joke. Imagine showing up in 2025 in full bombazine and veil, exclaiming, "I'm just following the rules." You might raise a few eyebrows. A mainstream historical fact underscores this continuity. The idea of dressing in black for mourning predated the Victorians by centuries, but it was their obsession with formalizing these practices that etched black as the color of grief into cultural memory. Today, even after we've discarded strict year-long schedules and multi-stage outfit changes, black still symbolizes a respectful somberness at funerals around the globe. And in more casual contexts, the black armband has become a shorthand for public mourning, worn by athletes on the field, political figures in a press conference, or even entire nations after a national tragedy. Historians still argue whether the Victorian fixation on mourning fashion directly paved the way for modern traditions, or whether it simply accelerated a trend already in motion. Some scholars highlight Queen Victoria's enduring influence, pointing out how decades of her visible sorrow cemented black's special place in Western cultural consciousness. Others suggest it would have happened anyway, that black, being both sober and elegant, naturally emerged as the default funeral color. Whatever the truth, it's clear that the Victorians left a mark deeper than any temporary fad could. Rounding a corner, you spot a high-end boutique window with a display of black dresses. A slim sign reads, "Timeless Elegance." You think back to the rigid protocols of Victorian half-mourning and can't help but chuckle at how an everyday wardrobe staple might have originated in part from such formal, sorrow-laden beginnings. There's your second joke. Little did Coco Chanel know she was tapping into the spiritual successor of widow's weeds. Of course, the modern black dress has shed the connotations of unrelieved sadness, becoming a symbol of chic versatility. But the link remains an echo of a time when black was worn in devotion to the departed rather than to blend easily from office meeting to cocktail hour. Beyond fashion, traces of Victorian mourning rituals pop up in more subtle ways. Think of those small memorial pins or ribbons people wear today following a tragedy, or the use of carefully chosen funeral flowers that speak to solemn respect. Sure, we don't typically embroider anchors for lost sailors or gather locks of hair for jewelry, but the impulse to materialize grief, turning it into an object or symbol, lives on. You recall the quirky tidbit of memorial tattoos. In modern times, people sometimes incorporate ashes of a loved one into tattoo ink, a new spin on the Victorian hair jewelry tradition of keeping a piece of the person close. The forms may have changed, but the basic human desire remains the same. You pause at a trendy cafe, overhearing snippets of conversation someone's discussing a memorial service they recently attended, describing how guests wore tasteful black attire, but with no set rules. Another mentions a black band worn at a sports event to honor a teammate who passed away. These are faint reflections of the old social codes, free from the suffocating strictness, yet undeniably tied to that heritage. Perhaps one day, future generations will see even these customs morph into something else. Kaleidoscope of color, or an entirely new symbolic practice. But for now, black remains a potent visual shorthand for loss. Further down the street, you pass a contemporary funeral home. Its signage is modern and understated. No black swags or carved angels. Even so, the window display features an all-black suit on a mannequin, paired with a simple black ribbon. The text beneath reads, "Honoring traditions, easing your journey." You imagine a 19th century undertaker stepping into our era, eyebrows raised at the simplicity of it all. Where are the velvet draperies, the immaculate hearses and horse plumes? But maybe it's enough. Strangely, even stripped of grand spectacle, the essential core, clothing ourselves in mourning, persists. Historians who explore the evolution of fashion often note that trends rarely die outright, they adapt. Like a living organism, they shed the more cumbersome elements and adopt new shapes. Victorian mourning customs underwent a metamorphosis from extreme ritual into a subtler etiquette, still recognized but no longer enforced by social decree. You sense that many people today might not even know the roots of why black is associated with funerals, yet the tradition endures. Cultural memory passed down unconsciously. You consider how the digital era handles grief. Online memorial pages, tribute videos, and hashtag movements all serve a parallel function to Victorian crepe and black ribbons they broadcast loss. Yet, just as Victorians once worried about who was or wasn't mourning correctly, modern users debate the etiquette of posting funeral photos or writing long eulogies on social media. In many ways, the conversation sounds familiar. How public should grief be? How soon is too soon to move on? The medium may have changed from parlors to platforms, but the tension endures. But there's your third joke. Imagine Queen Victoria's Instagram feed, perpetually draped in black borders, hashtags like Victorian Mourning, famous you Albert. Stepping away from the cafe, you follow the light into a more open square. The sun beams warmly, a subtle reminder that even the darkest chapters eventually fade. You're left thinking about how Victorian mourning rules, once labyrinthine and inescapable, now survive mostly in symbolic gestures. A black dress at a funeral, a quiet conversation about grief, a moment of silence at a stadium. They're small echoes of a time when sorrow dominated every stitch of fabric and every corner of conversation. Freed from the strict schedules and suffocating creep, these echoes might just be a gentler, more adaptable way to honor what the Victorians held dear, the idea that when someone leaves us, we mark their absence tangibly, if only for a while. And with that, you take one last glance at the boutique window, marveling at how elegantly black has persisted. No longer a mandatory shroud, but still, in certain moments, a tender nod to those long-gone customs. Then you step forward, letting the present beckon you onward, knowing that the legacy of Victorian mourning has found its quiet home in today's world, not vanished, but seamlessly woven into the fabric of everyday life. You stand at the threshold of a quiet, lamplit study where the remnants of Victorian mourning still cast faint shadows. Yet there's a sense of closure in the air, a recognition that, for all its somber trappings, the era of endless black creep and rigid etiquette could not stretch on forever. As you take a slow breath, you recall the countless details you've gathered, the scratchy bombazine gowns, the subtle transitions from inky black to muted greys, the veils that signaled sorrow so publicly, and the commerce that flourished around these customs. They form a tapestry woven from sadness and spectacle, devotion and societal pressure. You notice a large desk, its polished surface reflecting the gentle glow of a single lamp. Stacks of papers lie there, many bearing black borders, some with half-faded stamps that recall a funeral invitation long past. There's an old letter on top, dated near the close of the 19th century, in which a niece gently informs her aunt that she won't be prolonging her mourning attire for a distant cousin she scarcely knew. She offers apologies, but stands firm, writing, "Life presses onward, and I must do the same." You feel a pang of empathy for this young woman who braved the quiet disapproval of her elders to assert that sorrow should sometimes be private, not choreographed. Nearby, a portrait on the wall arrests your attention, a matron in half-mourning, her expression serene yet tinged with introspection. The tiny brushstrokes highlight her lavender sleeves, the bit of color a small but powerful statement of moving forward. She holds a single flower, a white lily, while wearing a modest jet brooch. It's a portrait that seems suspended between two worlds, the weighty tradition of full mourning and the fresh air of modern possibility. If you lean in, you almost expect the figure to breathe, to blink, to say, "We grieved, but we also lived." If you sift through all the clippings, diaries, and private letters from that time, you'll find a collective push and pull families who insisted on following Queen Victoria's example to the letter, and those who gradually peeled away layer after layer of black fabric, not out of irreverence, but out of sheer necessity. Life demanded color, motion, and laughter, inevitable forces that bubble up even in the face of bereavement. So that's your first joke. Imagine a mother telling her teenage daughter, "No dancing in that black gown," only to find the girl waltzing quietly behind closed doors anyway. Historians still argue whether the gradual decline in strict mourning practices was sparked by economic constraints, societal evolutions, or a mixture of the two. Likely it was all of those factors plus one more, the inextinguishable human spirit that gently rebels against being locked in perpetual gloom. Even as the official rulebooks dictated layers of crépi and timelines measured in months, real people discovered that love and memory aren't confined to visible tokens alone. Some found freedom in simpler funerals, quiet graveside farewells without the ostentatious parade of black horses. Others trimmed their mourning periods, opting to show devotion through acts of charity or by planting a memorial garden. Meanwhile, industrial progress accelerated railways, factories, and global trade, and with progress came new ideas, including updated fashions and more cosmopolitan perspectives. By the turn of the 20th century, the ironclad conventions that once seemed immortal started to crack. World events, wars, medical breakthroughs, shifts in women's roles, reshaped society, hastening the demise of the fussy, hyper-structured mourning system. That doesn't mean it disappeared overnight, it lingered in pockets, sometimes well into the 1900s. But the unchallenged dominance of all black dress for extended periods was drawing to a close. In this lamplit study, you might picture a Victorian grandmother telling her grandchildren about the old days, when one wore black for a year and a day, minimum, to honor a departed spouse. The children would likely stare, incredulous. "Really, Grandma? That long?" Perhaps she'd smile wistfully, remembering how stifling it felt, and yet how it provided a sense of communal recognition of her loss. Then, with a soft chuckle, she'd confess relief that times had changed. "There's your second joke, Grandma. Might add I don't miss the itching cra-p though." "No, sir." A small bookshelf to your right houses volumes of etiquette guides, each dog-eared and filled with lines about how to wear mourning properly. As you thumb through them, it's striking how thoroughly they once governed daily life, whether you could visit a friend, how you should answer a door, what to do if you met someone new while in half mourning. The orchestration of social interaction was as precise as a dance, and those who missed a step risked censure or scandal. Yet your modern eyes also spot the deep care embedded in these rules, a recognition that death is profound, that the living need a structured way to grapple with grief, and that community plays a role in that journey. You set the book aside and let your gaze drift to a window overlooking a quiet garden. The final rays of twilight cast long silhouettes of rose bushes onto the floor. Roses, once used to symbolize love, devotion, and occasionally used at Victorian funerals to mask unpleasant smells, now simply stand there as ornamental plants, unburdened by the era's strict symbolism. The hush in the room feels comforting, a gentle reminder that endings can be tranquil, even if they follow periods of intense sorrow. In your mind, you see the entire spectrum of Victorian mourning laid out from start to finish: the first black ribbons, the heavy gloom of full mourning, the incremental lightening to grey or lavender, and finally the day when the world regained its colour and bustle. Death was never trivial to these people, but as the modern era dawned, so did the realization that grief could be meaningful without being so rigidly policed. Some families embraced this shift wholeheartedly, others resisted, calling it a symptom of moral decline. But time, as always, marched on, and here you stand, in a moment suspended between their world and yours, feeling the echoes of centuries swirling softly around you. The Victorians have left you with a rich tapestry of sorrow, devotion, commerce, and, yes, even comedic absurdities. There's your third joke somewhere. An ancestor is rolling their eyes that we ever found humor in such a solemn subject. But perhaps acknowledging the lighter sides of these customs helps us see them for what they truly were: a grand, complicated effort to cope with one of life's hardest realities, all under the spotlight of social expectation. You gently rest your hand on the doorknob, ready to exit this subdued study. Behind you lies an era that once believed mourning should be publicly displayed, etched into fabric and pinned to your very being. Ahead is the knowledge that while times change, grief remains universal, love remains powerful, and we still seek ways to honor our departed, perhaps in simpler ceremonies, or heartfelt speeches, or even just in private tears shed when nobody's watching. The ritual evolves, but the emotion endures. Now, let's gently shift into a slower rhythm, allowing everything you've heard to settle like soft evening mist. Feel the weight of the day slipping away from your shoulders, replaced by a gentle warmth at the center of your being. The candlelight in your mind's eye softens, its glow turning calm and steady, beckoning you toward a restful hush. Let your breaths grow deeper and more leisurely. Inhale, noticing the cool air. Exhale, letting tension melt from your jaw, your neck, your entire body. Imagine each breath carries the tranquility of a distant lullaby, the kind that soothes every corner of your thoughts. With each exhale, any lingering images of black veils and bustling streets begin to recede into the background, leaving a spacious calm. Visualize a quiet garden at dusk, its flowers gently swaying. The hush of the setting sun permeates the scene, as though nature itself is murmuring, "All is well, all is at peace." If stray thoughts visit, about the day's tasks or tomorrow's plans, welcome them kindly, then let them drift away like small clouds crossing a serene sky. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to solve right now. You're here, listening to the soft hush of a world winding down, your mind and body preparing to embrace the sweet cradle of sleep. Allow yourself to float on this serene current, each breath guiding you deeper into rest. Your eyelids grow heavier, your muscles soften, and a gentle stillness settles in. Soon, you'll be drifting into a calm, restorative slumber, where you can recharge and find gentle dreams waiting. You are safe, at ease, and ready to let the night carry you into its tranquil embrace.